In our quiet suburban home, mornings were always a whirlwind of activity. Katie dashed around, searching for her shoes, while William frantically packed his homework into his backpack. Meanwhile, I rushed to finish preparing lunches, juggling tasks, and my lukewarm coffee. The one constant was Margot, my wife, who would stride into the kitchen like she owned the world, immaculate, poised, and entirely engrossed in her phone. That morning was no different. William's permission slip sat on the counter, waiting for both of our signatures. I handed it to Margot as she skimmed through emails, her expression tight and focused. Without so much as a glance at the paper, she scribbled her name with the kind of hurried precision that suggested this was just one more box to check on her endless to-do list. Her voice carried a sharp edge as she muttered something about having real responsibilities, making it clear that her priorities were elsewhere. It stung more than I wanted to admit. The Margot I married had been warm, playful, and full of life. She'd laugh over breakfast, offer to help with the kids, and tease me about my mismatched socks. But those days seemed like a distant memory now. The kids felt it too. William, once eager for his mom's attention, had stopped asking her to come to his games. Katie, ever the artist, poured her feelings into her drawings. Her pictures of our family now showed Margot off to the side, surrounded by work items. It was as though even Katie, at her young age, understood where her mom's priorities truly lay. Whenever Katie hesitated to share her creations, I'd reassure her. But her quiet response, that her mom loved her job more, always left me fumbling for the right words. How could I convince her otherwise when I wasn't sure I believed it myself? Margot's absence extended beyond her physical distance. The late nights she chalked up to work had begun to carry a different weight. The faint scent of cologne that wasn't mine clung to her clothes, and her hurried retreats upstairs after arriving home made my stomach knot. I wanted to believe I was imagining things, that I was overthinking the little details. But the uneasy feeling in my gut was growing harder to ignore. The cracks in our family life were becoming harder to patch, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending everything was fine. One Saturday, I decided we needed a change, something simple to bring us together. A family outing to the park seemed like the perfect idea. William was thrilled at the chance to fly his new kite, and Katie carefully packed sandwiches in her favorite basket, her excitement infectious. Margot, as always, was preoccupied. Her phone buzzed constantly as she sat on the couch, typing furiously. I waited until the kids were ready before letting her know our plan. Without even looking up, she muttered something about needing to handle work for the board. Her excuse felt like a well-worn script. I asked her if she could put the work aside for just a couple of hours, just this once. Her response, clipped and dismissive, stung more than I expected. The board, she said, depended on her, and someone had to make sacrifices to keep things running. Frustration simmered as I loaded the kids into the car, leaving her behind with her laptop and phone. At the park, William's laughter and Katie's smile should have been enough to lift my spirits, but the weight of Margot's absence hung heavily in the air. The empty space beside me on the picnic blanket felt like a silent reminder of everything we were losing. That night, after the kids were asleep, I found myself alone in the living room, staring at the family photo on the mantel. It was taken years ago, before Margot's job consumed her life. Back then, she'd laughed easily, her arm slung casually around my shoulder as the kids beamed at the camera. Now, the version of her in that photo felt like a stranger. Margot came home late again, her heels clicking softly on the floor. She barely glanced in my direction as she made her way to the stairs, muttering something about a long day. I asked if work was getting to her, trying to gauge her reaction. She shrugged it off, her tone curt, as though my concern was an annoyance she didn't have time for. I let the conversation drop, but as I sat there in the quiet house, a growing unease settled over me. Something wasn't adding up, and the threads of our life together felt like they were unraveling faster than I could catch them. The following week, I started paying closer attention. It wasn't that I wanted to catch Margot in a lie, but there was an itch in the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. Her behavior wasn't just distant, it was calculated. She seemed careful, almost too careful, about what she shared. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, I noticed her laptop left open on the kitchen counter. Her work calendar was displayed, full of meetings and deadlines, as I'd expect. But a few blocks of time were marked simply as out of office, with no explanation. When I asked about it later, casually, she brushed it off as time blocked for personal errands, appointments, and things like that. Her answer was plausible, but the way she said it didn't sit right with me. She avoided my eyes, her tone clipped, like she was shutting down the conversation before it could go further. Over the next few days, I started noticing other small things. The faint scent of cologne lingered on her clothes after she claimed to be at the office. Her phone, once left casually on the table, now seemed glued to her hand or tucked away in her bag. And then there were her late-night arrivals, always accompanied by vague explanations about unexpected meetings or last-minute deadlines. I told myself I was overthinking it. Margot was busy, her job was demanding, and she'd always been ambitious. But the unease in my gut only grew stronger. One night, after she went to bed, I couldn't resist checking her phone. I'd never done it before, and the guilt gnawed at me as I swiped through her messages. Most of them were routine, work texts, chats with friends. But there was one thread that stopped me cold. The contact name was Just E. The messages weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. The tone was intimate, playful, the kind of exchange that felt entirely out of place for a married woman. Looking forward to tonight, one message read. Hope you can sneak away for a bit. My chest tightened as I read the words, my mind racing. I scrolled up, looking for more, but the thread ended abruptly. Most of the previous messages had been deleted. I put the phone back exactly as I'd found it, careful not to wake her. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, a sinking realization settled over me. This wasn't just in my head. Something was happening, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face it. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. Margot moved through her usual routine, calm and collected, while I struggled to keep my composure. The messages I'd read played over and over in my mind, their implications twisting like a knife in my gut. At breakfast, I tried to act normal for the kids. William was focused on a test he had that day, and Katie was busy drawing at the table, humming to herself. Meanwhile, Margot scrolled through her phone, occasionally muttering about emails and meetings. As she gathered her things to leave, I mentioned casually that I'd been thinking about her long hours. You should take a break sometime, I said. Maybe we could plan a family day soon? She gave me a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. Maybe. Things are hectic right now. You know how it is? With that, she grabbed her bag and breezed out the door, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and an overwhelming sense of unease. That day, I made a decision. If I was going to confront her, I needed more than just a feeling. I needed proof. It wasn't about trapping her. It was about finally understanding what was happening in our marriage. I started small, keeping track of her schedule and paying closer attention to her explanations. The gaps in her stories became more obvious. Meetings that didn't line up, calls she couldn't explain. I noticed her dressing differently on certain evenings, more effort put into her appearance than usual, even though she claimed it was just work. A few nights later, she came home late again. I stayed up pretending to read, but really I was watching her. She walked in quietly, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Her makeup was still perfectly done, her hair untouched by the long day she claimed to have had. Long night? I asked, keeping my voice light. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. Yeah, lots of back-to-back meetings. I'm exhausted. Her answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. She didn't even pause to elaborate, just headed straight upstairs to shower. I waited until I heard the water running before I checked her bag. It was a bold move, and my hands trembled as I unzipped it. At first, I saw nothing unusual, papers, her wallet, a few stray pens. But tucked into a side pocket was a receipt for a dinner at an expensive restaurant across town. The timestamp was from earlier that evening, well before she'd claimed to be stuck in meetings. I folded the receipt carefully and slid it into my pocket, then zipped the bag back up. My heart raced as I sat back down, trying to process what I'd just found. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. The receipt stayed in my pocket for days, a physical reminder of the growing cracks in our marriage. Every time I touched it, my chest tightened. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Maybe the right moment, or maybe just the courage to confront her. Margot, on the other hand, seemed entirely unbothered. She continued her usual routine, leaving early, returning late, and offering the same vague excuses about work. She was distant but polished, like a perfectly constructed facade. One evening, while helping Katie with her homework, I noticed William lingering by the door. His brows were furrowed, and he seemed hesitant. "What's up, buddy?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Is Mom mad at us?" he blurted out. The question caught me off guard. "Why would you think that?" He shrugged, his eyes darting to the floor. "She's always gone. And when she's here, she doesn't really talk to us. It's like she doesn't want to be around." His words cut deeper than anything Margot had said to me. I reassured him the best I could, but his question lingered in my mind long after he'd gone to bed. Margot wasn't just pulling away from me. She was pulling away from her family. That night, I decided to take things a step further. I installed a location tracking app on her phone. It was a simple program, easy to hide, and it would give me a clearer picture of where she was spending her time. It felt invasive, even wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed answers. The next day, while Margot was at work, I set up a small camera in the living room, pointed at the front door. I didn't know what I expected to catch, but I wanted to have something concrete to confirm my suspicions. By the time she got home that evening, I was on edge. She came in, her face flushed in a way that didn't match her usual tired demeanor. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she smiled faintly at the screen before quickly tucking it into her pocket. I didn't ask about her day. I didn't need to. Instead, I waited until she was upstairs before checking the app. Her location history showed a restaurant across town, the same one from the receipt, during the exact hours she was supposed to be at work. She'd lied to me again. Later that night, while she was in the shower, I checked the camera footage. It was only a few hours old, but it confirmed what I feared. She hadn't gone straight to work that morning. Instead, she'd left the house dressed for work, but returned midday, staying for about an hour before leaving again. I rewound the footage, watching her enter the house with a man. He was tall, dressed in business casual, and he didn't look like a coworker. They didn't linger long, just enough time for her to usher him inside, close the door, and emerge an hour later, looking freshly made up. My hands shook as I paused the footage. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was real. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. The footage replayed in my mind over and over, each detail sharper and more painful than the last. The way she had smiled at him, the casual ease with which she led him into our home, as if it were nothing. When Margot slipped into bed beside me, I stiffened, careful to keep my breathing even. She murmured something about her long day, but I didn't respond. The silence between us felt heavy, almost suffocating. The next morning, I went through the motions of our routine. I packed lunches, helped Katie with her hair, and double-checked William's homework. Margot moved through the kitchen like always, her phone in hand, sipping her coffee as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. After the kids left for school, I confronted her, or at least I tried to. "You came home yesterday," I started, keeping my tone steady. She froze for a moment, her expression flickering with something unreadable, before quickly recovering. "What are you talking about?" "You weren't at the office," I said, watching her closely. I checked. Her eyes narrowed, and her defensive tone kicked in immediately. "Are you seriously tracking me now, Jake? That's pathetic." Her words hit like a slap, but I pushed forward. "Who was the man you brought here?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. She scoffed, her lips curling into a cold smile. "You're unbelievable. Do you have any idea how much stress I'm under? Do you think I have time for whatever ridiculous fantasy you've cooked up?" The sheer audacity of her denial stunned me. She wasn't even trying to explain or deflect anymore, just dismissing my concerns outright, as though my feelings were irrelevant. I didn't press further. Not yet. Instead, I decided to gather more evidence. Her lies were like a game to her, and I realized she wasn't going to admit anything until I had proof she couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, I expanded my efforts. I adjusted the camera angles to cover more of the house and set up a recording device in her car. I hated what I was doing. It felt wrong on so many levels, but I couldn't live in the dark any longer. The recording device was what finally cracked things wide open. One evening, after she left for yet another work meeting, I retrieved the recorder and played it back. Her conversations were muffled at first, just the faint hum of the car and the occasional sound of music. But then her voice came through, clear and unmistakable. "I'll be there in 20, she said, her tone lighter than I'd heard it in years. "No, Jake has no idea. He never does." There was a pause, followed by laughter, hers and a man's. "Of course," she continued. "It's just dinner. I'll tell him I'm working late like always. He'll buy it." The casual cruelty in her words made my stomach churn. It wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was the ease with which she lied, the confidence that I wouldn't suspect a thing. As I sat there listening, I realized that this wasn't about work stress or drifting apart. This was deliberate. She was making a choice, again and again, to put someone else above her family. Above me. That night, I made a choice too. I wasn't going to let her lies go unanswered. The next morning, I felt a cold resolve settle over me. I had spent weeks, maybe months, convincing myself I needed more proof, more clarity, but now I saw it for what it was: fear. Fear of confrontation. fear of losing what little remained of the life we'd built together. Margot breezed through the kitchen as always, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. She kissed Katie on the head, gave William a quick pat on the shoulder, and offered me a tight smile that didn't match the warmth she showed the kids. "Busy day ahead," she said, grabbing her coffee. "Don't wait up tonight. I got a late meeting." My stomach turned at the ease with which she lied. It was the same routine, the same hollow excuse, but this time I knew exactly what it meant. When she left for work, I reviewed the footage from the previous day. There he was again, the same man, the same casual intimacy. They didn't stay long this time, maybe an hour, but it was enough. Enough to confirm what I already knew. I stared at the screen, my jaw clenched, wondering how she could do this. How she could stand in the kitchen, sip her coffee, and look me in the eye after doing what she did. The betrayal felt deeper with each passing day, not just because of the act itself, but because of the sheer audacity of her deceit. That evening, I decided to follow her. She left the house dressed impeccably, as though heading to a business dinner. I waited a few minutes, then grabbed my keys and headed out. Her car was easy to spot, and she didn't drive far, just across town to a quiet restaurant tucked away on a side street. I parked a few spaces down, far enough to avoid drawing attention, and waited. She got out of the car, smoothing her dress, and a moment later he appeared. The man from the footage. He greeted her with a smile that made my blood boil, and she laughed, a light, carefree sound I hadn't heard from her in years. I stayed in the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I thought about storming in, confronting them right then and there, but something held me back. Maybe it was the kids, or maybe it was the realization that this moment wouldn't be the end of it. I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone, snapping a few pictures. It felt dirty, invasive, but I needed something tangible, something she couldn't deny. When they went inside, I drove home, my mind racing. By the time she returned that night, I was sitting in the living room, the picture saved on my phone, waiting for the moment I knew had to come. When she walked in, she didn't seem surprised to see me awake. She offered a half-hearted excuse about the meeting running late and started to head upstairs. "Margot," I said, my voice steady but firm. She froze, turning slowly to face me. "What is it?" I held up my phone, the screen lighting up with a picture of her and the man outside the restaurant. "You want to explain this?" Her face paled, but only for a moment. Then her expression hardened, her lips curling into a faint smirk. "You've been following me? That's low, Jake. Even for you." Even now, she didn't deny it. She didn't try to explain. Instead, she turned it around as though I was the one in the wrong. "You lied to me," I said, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. "You lied to me, to the kids. And for what?" "Him." She shrugged, her expression cold. "Maybe if you paid more attention, Jake, I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere." Her words hit me like a slap. She wasn't just dismissing my pain. She was blaming me for it. "You've been gone for a long time, Margot," I said quietly. "But this is different. This isn't just about work or distance. This is a choice. And you made it." She didn't respond. She just stood there, her arms crossed, waiting for me to say something else. But I didn't. Instead, I stood and walked past her, heading upstairs. That night, I slept in the guest room. The guest room was cold and unfamiliar, but it felt like a necessary distance. Lying there, I thought about all the little moments that had led us to this point. Every late-night meeting, every excuse, every time she'd brushed off the kids or me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to see. The next morning, the kids noticed something was off. William asked why I'd slept in the guest room, his voice cautious, like he already knew the answer but didn't want to hear it. Katie, still too young to understand the complexities, simply hugged me tighter before running off to find her crayons. Margot acted like nothing had happened. She moved through the kitchen with her usual precision, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone. If she felt any remorse or guilt, she didn't show it. "Jake, can you take the kids to school today?" she asked casually, as though the night before hadn't happened. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My words felt heavy, too sharp to unleash in front of the kids. After dropping them off, I drove aimlessly for a while, my thoughts spiraling. Part of me wanted to confront her again, to demand answers, but another part of me realized it wouldn't matter. Margot had already made it clear where she stood. Her arrogance, her coldness, had left little room for reconciliation. When I returned home, I found her in the living room on a conference call. Her voice was confident, professional, the version of her I used to admire. But now, It only deepened the sense of betrayal. As she ended the call, she glanced at me and raised an eyebrow. "You're still upset about last night?" Her casual tone made my blood boil. "You lied, Margot. You've been lying for months. Don't act like this is some small misunderstanding." She sighed, as though my anger was an inconvenience. "I told you, Jake. Things haven't been working between us for a long time. Maybe if you'd put in more effort." "Stop." I cut her off, my voice firm. "You don't get to twist this. You don't get to blame me for what you've done." She crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "And what do you want me to do, Jake? Apologize? Beg for forgiveness? You've been checked out for years. Maybe this is what we needed to wake you up." Her words were like a knife to the chest, each one twisting deeper. I wanted to shout, to yell, to make her see what she was doing to our family, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Instead, I took a deep breath and stepped back. "You've made your choices, Margot," I said quietly. "But don't expect me to clean up the mess for you." I left the room before she could respond, heading upstairs to gather my thoughts. Every step felt heavier, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me. I spent the rest of the day going through the motions, avoiding her as much as possible. The kids came home, and I did my best to keep things normal for them. Margot, on the other hand, stayed late at work, or so she said. When she finally came home that night, I didn't bother waiting for her. I locked the guest room door and lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer I could hold this fractured life together. The days that followed were a blur of tension and avoidance. Margot's demeanor didn't change. If anything, she seemed emboldened, as if her actions had been justified. She moved through the house like a queen in her domain, unbothered by the chaos she had caused. I kept my focus on the kids. They were my anchor in the storm, and I wasn't about to let Margot's choices pull them down with us. Katie had a school art competition coming up, and William's soccer team was gearing up for the playoffs. I threw myself into their world, showing up for every practice, helping with every project. It was the one thing I could control. Margot, on the other hand, seemed even more absent. When she wasn't at work, she was locked in her room or glued to her phone, her face lit by the glow of her screen. She was a ghost in her own home, and the kids were beginning to notice. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, William looked up from his plate and asked, "Is Mom okay?" The question caught me off guard. "Why do you ask, buddy?" He shrugged, poking at his food. "She's always gone. And when she's here, it's like she doesn't want to talk to us." Katie chimed in, her little voice filled with concern. "She didn't even look at my painting yesterday. She just said it was nice and went back to her phone." Their words broke something in me. Margot's betrayal had hurt me deeply, but seeing the effect it was having on our children was a whole new kind of pain. That night, after putting them to bed, I sat in the living room, trying to decide what to do. The weight of the situation felt unbearable. I couldn't keep living like this, waiting for Margot to admit her faults, hoping she'd choose her family over whatever it was she thought she needed. The camera footage became my constant companion. Every evening, I'd review the day's recordings, looking for patterns, for answers. It felt obsessive, but I needed clarity. And then one night I found it. The footage showed Margot arriving home in the middle of the day, just as she'd done before. This time, though, she wasn't alone. The same man from the restaurant walked through the door with her, carrying a small gift bag. They didn't linger in the living room. She led him upstairs, out of the camera's view, but their laughter echoed through the house. I clenched my fists, my breathing shallow as I watched the scene unfold. It was no longer just about the betrayal. It was the brazenness of it, the way she treated our home like a playground for her lies. That night, I didn't bother waiting for her to return. I gathered the footage, the receipts, and the messages, organizing them into a folder. I wasn't sure what my next move would be, but I knew one thing. This wasn't going to end with me silently suffering in the shadows. When Margot came home that night, I stayed in the guest room. I didn't want to see her, didn't want to hear her excuses or her casual lies. The folder of evidence sat on the bedside table, a stark reminder of everything I had uncovered. The next morning, I was up early making breakfast for the kids. Margot came down shortly after, her hair perfectly styled, her face glowing as though she'd had the best sleep of her life. She greeted the kids warmly, but her eyes avoided mine. As we sat at the table, I couldn't help but watch her. She laughed at Katie's jokes, nodded at William's stories about soccer practice, and acted like the perfect, engaged mother. But I could see the cracks in her performance. The way she glanced at her phone every few minutes, the way her smile faltered when she caught me looking at her. After breakfast, she announced she had errands to run. The kids were disappointed. They'd been hoping she'd spend the day with them. Margot brushed off their protests, promising she'd be back in time for dinner. As soon as she left, I sat down with the kids. "How about we do something fun today?" I asked. Katie's face lit up. "Can we go to the zoo?" "Absolutely," I said, relieved to have a distraction. The day was a welcome reprieve. Watching William and Katie run from exhibit to exhibit, their faces full of wonder, reminded me of what mattered most. For a few hours, I was able to forget about the weight on my shoulders. But reality came crashing back when we returned home. Margot's car was already in the driveway, and as we stepped inside, I could feel the tension hanging in the air. She was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone. "You were out all day?" she asked, her tone light, but with an edge of irritation. I nodded. "Took the kids to the zoo. They had a great time." She didn't respond, just kept staring at her phone. The silence between us was thick, filled with everything we weren't saying. That evening, after the kids were in bed, I decided it was time. I walked into the living room, the folder in hand. Margot looked up from her phone, her expression wary. "What's that?" she asked. I sat down across from her, placing the folder on the coffee table. "It's everything. The text, the footage, the receipts. I know, Margot. I know about him. I know about everything." Her face froze for a moment. Then she let out a short, bitter laugh. "You've been spying on me?" I didn't respond. The truth was laid bare between us, and I wasn't going to let her twist it. She leaned back, crossing her arms. "So what now, Jake? You think this little folder is going to change anything?" Her arrogance stunned me, but it also steeled my resolve. "I'm done, Margot. You've made your choices. Now I'm making mine." She stared at me, her composure faltering for the first time. "And what does that mean?" "It means I'm not playing along anymore," I said. "You want to throw this family away? Fine. But you're not going to drag me and the kids down with you." Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But instead, she stood and walked out of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. I sat there for a long time, the weight of the confrontation settling over me. It wasn't the resolution I had hoped for, but it was a start. Margot didn't come to bed that night. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling in the guest room, replaying our conversation in my head. Her lack of remorse, her defiance, it all felt surreal. I had expected anger, maybe even tears, but what I got was indifference, as if our marriage meant nothing to her. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. Margot was gone before the kids woke up, leaving no note or explanation. William and Katie didn't seem surprised. They had grown used to her disappearing acts, though they still tried to mask their disappointment. "Where's Mom?" William asked over breakfast, his tone casual but his eyes searching mine for answers. "She had to leave early for work," I said, forcing a smile. "But we'll have a good day, just the three of us." After dropping the kids at school, I drove around aimlessly, my thoughts racing. Margot's betrayal had shattered my trust, but now it was starting to feel like the entire foundation of our life together was crumbling. I needed clarity, needed to decide what came next. Divorce seemed inevitable, but the thought of uprooting the kids' lives filled me with dread. I couldn't bear the idea of them being caught in the middle of our mess. That afternoon, I received a text from Margot. "We need to talk tonight. I'll be home around 8. The message was cold, devoid of any emotion or acknowledgement of what had happened the night before. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew I needed to stay composed. When she walked through the door that evening, she looked the same as ever, poised, confident, completely unbothered. She set her bag down and glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "Let's get this over with," she said, sitting down across from me in the living room. Her tone set me on edge, but I held my ground. "Go ahead," I said, folding my arms. "What do you want to say?" She hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "Look, Jake, I know I've made mistakes, but we're both at fault here. You've been checked out for years, and I've had to carry this family on my own. Maybe if you'd been more supportive." "Stop," I interrupted, my voice firm. "You don't get to rewrite this. I've been here every step of the way. I've been the one holding this family together while you've been. Wherever you've been." Her eyes flashed with irritation. "So what? You want me to grovel? Beg for forgiveness? Because that's not going to happen." I leaned forward, my voice low but steady. "I don't want your apology, Margot. I want you to be honest. For once, admit what you've done. Admit that you chose him over us." For the first time, her composure cracked. She looked away, her jaw tight, and for a moment I thought she might actually say something real. But then she stood, grabbing her bag. "I don't have to listen to this," she said, heading for the door. "Running away again?" I called after her. She paused, her back to me. Maybe I just need space, she said, her voice cold. Maybe we both do. The door slammed behind her, leaving me alone in the silence of the house. The silence after she left was deafening. For a long time, I sat there, staring at the closed door, wondering if this was the end. Her words echoed in my head, cold, dismissive, as though all the years we'd spent together were nothing more than a contractual obligation she was ready to walk away from. When the kids came home, I pushed everything to the back of my mind. They didn't need to see my frustration or feel the weight of what was happening between their parents. Katie showed me a new drawing she'd made in art class, a colorful rendition of a sunny day at the park. William talked about his upcoming soccer game, his excitement tempered by a flicker of hesitation, as though he didn't expect Margot to be there. I reassured him, promising that I'd be there no matter what. And I meant it. That night, Margot didn't come home. There was no text, no call, just her absence hanging over the house like a shadow. I checked the tracking app I'd installed on her phone. She was at a hotel across town. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. This wasn't a meeting or a work obligation. She'd left her family to spend the night with him. I wanted to be angry, wanted to shout or punch something, but all I felt was a deep, hollow sadness. The woman I'd loved, the mother of my children, was no longer the person I thought she was. She hadn't just betrayed me. She'd betrayed our family, our life, everything we'd built together. The next morning, Margot waltzed in as though nothing had happened. She was dressed casually, her hair pulled back, her demeanor calm and collected. "Good morning," she said lightly, heading straight for the coffee maker. I didn't respond. I couldn't. She glanced at me over her shoulder, raising an eyebrow. "What's with the silent treatment?" I stood, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You didn't come home last night," I said, my voice low but firm. She didn't even flinch. "I needed space," she replied, her tone indifferent. "Space," I repeated, the word heavy with disbelief. "From what? Your family? Your kids? Or just me?" She shrugged, sipping her coffee. "Sometimes people need a break, Jake. It's not a crime." Her nonchalance made my blood boil. "It's not a crime, but it's a choice," I shot back. "And you keep making the same one. Over and over again." Her eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a faint smirk. "And what are you going to do about it, Jake? Huh? Keep following me? Snooping through my things? You think that makes you better than me?" Her deflection was predictable, but it didn't make it any less infuriating. "This isn't about me," I said. "It's about you, and the fact that you've given up on this family while pretending you haven't." For a moment, something flickered in her expression. Guilt, maybe, or regret. But just as quickly it was gone. She set her coffee down and walked past me, her heels clicking against the floor. "I don't have time for this," she said over her shoulder. "I've got work to do." The door to her office closed with a click, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen, the tension between us thick and suffocating. That day, I started making plans. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a house with someone who had clearly checked out of our marriage. It wasn't just about me anymore. William and Katie deserved better. They deserved stability, honesty, and a home where they didn't have to tiptoe around tension and lies. I reached out to a lawyer I'd found online, setting up an appointment for later in the week. The process felt surreal, like I was walking through someone else's life. Divorce had always seemed like a distant, almost impossible scenario, a worst-case outcome that happened to other people. But now, it felt inevitable. The day of the appointment, I told Margot I'd be working late. She didn't even question it, too busy with her own schedule to notice or care. The lawyer, a sharp and empathetic woman named Claire, listened intently as I laid everything out. The late nights, the lies, the evidence I'd gathered. She didn't flinch when I showed her the photos, the messages, or the footage. "You have a solid case," she said. "If you want to move forward, we can file for divorce citing adultery. It won't change much in terms of the division of assets, but we'll give you leverage for custody arrangements." Custody. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't let myself think that far ahead, but now it was unavoidable. The thought of sharing custody with Margot, of sending William and Katie off to stay with her while she carried on with her new life, made my stomach churn. Claire must have seen the worry on my face. "If you want primary custody, we'll need to prove that her behavior is detrimental to the kids. The evidence you've gathered helps, but we'll also need character witnesses, people who can speak to her absence and the impact it's had on the children." I nodded, the weight of the situation settling on my shoulders. It was going to be a fight, but for the kids, it was a fight I was willing to take on. When I got home that evening, Margot was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone. She looked up briefly, her expression neutral. Long day, she asked, her tone devoid of real interest. Yeah, I replied, keeping my voice even. She didn't press for details, and I didn't offer any. The distance between us felt insurmountable, a chasm that grew wider with each passing day. Later that night, as I tucked Katie into bed, she looked up at me with wide, curious eyes. "Daddy, is Mommy mad at us?" Her question broke my heart. "No, sweetheart," I said gently. "Mommy's just busy right now." Katie nodded, satisfied with the answer, but I could see the doubt lingering in her expression. As I sat alone in the guest room that night, I made a silent promise to myself. No matter how messy or complicated things got, I would protect them. They deserved better than this fractured version of a family. And if Margot couldn't see that, then it was up to me to make it happen. The days that followed were a blur of careful preparation. I worked closely with Claire, gathering more evidence and documenting everything I could about Margot's behavior. I started keeping a journal, detailing her absences, the way she interacted with the kids, and the increasingly obvious disconnect between her words and actions. Meanwhile, Margot seemed oblivious to the storm brewing around her. She continued her routine of late nights and early mornings, her phone always within reach, her attention elsewhere. If she suspected anything, she didn't show it. One evening, she came home earlier than usual, a rare occurrence. The kids were thrilled, rushing to show her their drawings and tell her about their day. She smiled and nodded, but I could see the way her gaze flickered back to her phone, the way her answers felt rehearsed and distant. When the kids were asleep, I confronted her again. This time, I wasn't angry. I was calm, determined to get through to her, even if it felt impossible. "You're not here, Margot," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Not for me, not for the kids. Do you even see what this is doing to them?" She looked up from her phone, her expression annoyed. "Jake, I'm tired. Can we not do this right now?" "Tired from what?" I asked, the frustration creeping into my tone despite my efforts to stay composed. "From work? From lying? From him?" Her eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she stood, her movements sharp and deliberate. "You think you have it all figured out, don't you?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think you're some saint, holding this family together while I'm the villain. I think I'm the only one who's still trying," I shot back. She stared at me for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then, without another word, she grabbed her bag and walked out the door. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, I felt the weight of finality settle over me. This wasn't just a rough patch or a misstep in our marriage. It was a choice. Her choice. The next day, I finalized the paperwork with Claire. The divorce petition was ready to be filed, and my request for primary custody was solid. I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow, knowing that I was taking the first real step toward ending something I had once thought would last forever. When Margot came home that evening, I was ready. The folder of paperwork sat on the kitchen table, waiting for her. She glanced at it as she walked in, her brows furrowing. "What's this?" "Read it," I said simply, stepping aside to let her sit. She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. I watched her expression change, the realization dawning slowly. For the first time in months, she looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. "Fear. You're serious," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "This isn't just about us, Margot. It's about the kids. They deserve better than this." For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but then her shoulders slumped. She closed the folder and sat back, her face pale. "I didn't think you'd actually," she trailed off, shaking her head. "I didn't want to," I admitted. "But you left me no choice." For the first time in months, Margot was silent. The confident, dismissive woman who had walked through the door earlier was gone, replaced by someone I'd barely recognized. She stared at the folder on the table, her fingers tracing the edges of the papers as if she were trying to process what they represented. Finally, she spoke, her voice subdued. "I didn't think it would get to this point. I thought," she trailed off, shaking her head. "I don't know what I thought." I sat down across from her. Exhaustion etched into every part of me. "You made your choices, Margot. I tried to fix this, to reach you, but you kept shutting me out. And now," I gestured toward the folder, unable to finish the sentence. Her eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her in what felt like years. "I didn't mean to lose everything," she whispered. "I don't know, Jake. I felt trapped, like nothing I did was ever enough. For you, for the kids, for myself." The words caught me off guard. For all her lies, for all the pain she had caused, I hadn't expected this glimpse of vulnerability. But I didn't let it sway me. You didn't lose everything, Margot. You threw it away. And now you're realizing the cost. Her head bowed, and she wiped at her eyes. What happens now? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I filed for divorce. I'm asking for primary custody of the kids. They need stability, Margot, and right now you're not giving them that. She flinched, the weight of my words hitting her hard. For a moment, I thought she might fight back, argue that she was still their mother and deserved a place in their lives. But instead, she nodded slowly. You're right. I haven't been there for them. For any of you. Her admission surprised me. I had braced myself for anger, deflection, but what I got instead was quiet resignation. Over the next few weeks, things changed. Margot moved into a small apartment downtown, a decision she made without protest. She started attending therapy, a step she said was long overdue. She showed up for the kids more often, making an effort to be present at William's games and Katie's art shows. It wasn't an instant transformation. There were still moments of tension, still scars from everything we had been through. But there was also something new, a sense of accountability, a willingness to rebuild, even if it was from the ashes of what we once had. One evening, as we sat together at Katie's art exhibit, Margot turned to me. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For not giving up on the kids. For being the parent they needed when I wasn't. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. Her words didn't erase the pain or fix the past, but they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. In the months that followed, we found a new rhythm. We weren't a couple anymore, but we were still a family in some ways. Co-parenting became our focus, and while it wasn't always easy, it worked because we both knew what mattered most. One night, as I tucked Katie in a bed, she looked up at me and smiled. Mom's been nicer lately, she said. Do you think she'll stay like this? I smiled back, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I hope so, sweetheart. For you and William, I really hope so. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it might be possible.